So Bucky's point with this whole Corvette business was perfect. You know, a car was meant to be driven. Now, I think that this is Jesus' point with the parable of the 3 talents. The servants who were given money, and each one a different amount, and each one, you know, some of them invested the money, and one of them decided not to. If you have your Bibles handy, let's turn to that passage right quick. Beginning at verse 14. Again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants and entrusted his money to them while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of silver to one, 2 bags of silver to another, and 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. He then left on his trip. The servant who received the 5 bags of silver, began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant with 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned 2 more. But the servant who received the 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. After a long time, their master returned from his trip and called them to give an account of how they had used his money. The servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, "Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 5 more." The master was full of praise. "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together." The servant who had received the 2 bags of silver came forward and said, "Master, you gave me 2 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 2 more." The master said, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together." And then the servant with the 1 bag of silver came and said, "Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I would lose your money, so I hid it in the earth. Look, here is your money back." But the master replied, "You wicked and lazy servant, if you knew I harvested crops I didn't plant and gathered crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it." Then he ordered, "Take the money from the servant and give it to the one with 10 bags of silver. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And that is scary. But I want to steal a line from the book. If you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. John Ortberg writes this, and I added a few extra jobs at the end of this, and you'll see. But he writes, "The master is coming back. He's going to settle up with all the CEOs, presidents, prime ministers, network anchors, mothers and fathers, plumbers, teachers, nurses, salesmen, carpenters, welders, secretaries, ministers, truck drivers, fishermen, you and me. And he's going to ask us, 'What did you do with what I gave you?'" So now last week we talked about that initial getting out of the boat. But now this week we're kind of looking at, well, what are we going to do when we get out of the boat? Why do you want to get out of the boat? It's not just, for me, it's not just about doing a whole bunch of uncomfortable things outside of our comfort zone just so that everything's okay, so that we're doing a million things that we weren't really destined to do. That being said, there are exceptions to that rule. Weymouth is the perfect example of that. I know this for a fact because I've heard it audibly, not from God, but from some of the leaders, that getting up and preaching on Sunday is not their thing. Am I right in saying that? Like, I'm not lying. I'm not making a big fool of myself, am I? It's not their thing. They're going way out of their comfort zone to stand up here to speak. But it had to be done. It's kind of a temporary void. So yes, I think we're called to jump out of the boat and do things that makes us a little uncomfortable. But I also think that there is that one thing that God's asking us to do, and for whatever reason, even though we're good at it, we lack confidence in it, or we've built other routines in life so that as soon as we kind of go outside of that routine a little bit, we assume that this new routine that we're trying to do is wrong. We just have that negative association with something new. It must be wrong. It's not wrong. You're destined to do at least one thing. You've got at least one gift, one thing that you are good at, that God has given you. And for some reason, we're scared to death to get out of the boat and do the very thing that we're supposed to do. I want us to turn to Romans chapter 12. And maybe it's just my brain, but it works weird. It works really weird. I usually kind of work backwards with things instead of frontward, from the beginning forward. So I want us to start at verse 6, but eventually I'm going to go back to Romans 12, verse 1 and 2. So I want us to go to chapter 12, verse 6. In His grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. And I love this verse. In His grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well, which means He didn't put you on this earth to do a million things that you stink at. He didn't. He put you on this earth for at least one thing that you can do really well. It might be 2 things, it might be 10 things. But He's got you here for a very specific reason. Now, to jump back to verse 1. Just the latter half of verse 1. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind He will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship Him. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So if you want to know how to figure out if what you're doing is part of God's will, well, if it looks exactly like everything about this world, it's probably not something that God is asking you to do. See, this is the part where we can get into details about that, but I'm not even 100% sure what that looks like. But I think it's very interesting that in verse 1, he uses living, which is, living is a process. It's not just something you do in 5 minutes or a half an hour, but living is that process. And holy means to be set apart. So then in verse 2, he says, don't copy the behavior of everybody else. And then later in verse 6, he said, you're given a gift to do something, to do a certain thing well. So when you do that certain thing well, it's from God, it's not going to look like anything of this world. But that's how you live a holy life. Doing that thing that God is asking you to do automatically makes you set apart from your friends, maybe even fellow Christians, I don't know. But doing the will of God, pursuing that gift that God has given you, that's what's going to change your life. Because later we read that in the verse 2, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Your actions will never change until your thinking changes. So you can just naively jump out of the boat and land in the water, and then, unless you got little floaties on or something, and drown.